Hey folks, welcome to another episode of Turning Techies into Leaders. And today we're joined by Melissa Appel. And the reason we're here is that she's just published this book called Aligned, and that's changed the entire way that I think about stakeholder management. So she's joined us to talk about that topic and a few of those elements in there. So, firstly, thanks for joining us. How are you today? And welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I think stakeholder management is something that many people don't really think about. What led you to decide to co-write this book?
It was a book that I wanted to buy for some people on my team, and it didn't exist. So I decided I was going to write it. And actually, the original concept that I had was how to say no to stakeholders, because that's a critical thing that a lot of people don't know how to do or don't do well. And there's actually a whole chapter in the book about that. But I went to a few people that I know who had written books, and I went to my co-author Bruce McCarthy, and I asked him, what's the best piece of advice you have for somebody trying to write a book? And he said the best thing he did when he wrote his last book was to find a co-author who had already written a book. So I said, Bruce, do you want to write another book? And he said yes, thankfully. And he helped me expand the topic into more broader, all of stakeholder management, and not just saying no.
You've got 20 years more of experience in this field. If you were to go back to give yourself some advice 20 years ago, knowing now that you've put all this of your stuff in your mind on paper, what would be that piece of advice you'd give yourself 20 years ago?
I think about stakeholder management in particular
Hmm.
is to find out more about the individual people and what their motivations are, right? You think about playing politics or whatever, and you're like, it's a strategic maneuver, but it's really just about getting to know people and getting to know what drives them so that you can position whatever it is that you need in terms that will resonate with them and that will also be a benefit to them.
Yeah, I think the topic of resonating with them is something that I think often when we play politics, that's not you're thinking about it playing a game, but what you're saying is I just want to speak the same language as you. I want to
Mm-hmm.
align on similar values or similar
Right.
experiences we might have.
Yeah, if you think about like a political campaign, right? They try out different messaging and see what resonates with people. It's very similar. It's not like you're, trying to manipulate people or anything. But if you can speak to somebody in a language that resonates with them and you really let them know that you understand what they're going through and what they need, then you can build much better relationships.
And so, in a way, you're saying that stakeholder management is really relationships.
It is.
Although we don't think about that when push comes to shove in the business environment, it's always a stakeholder instead of just another contact.
Yeah.
Um, our focus here is kind of helping tech leaders develop some of these skill sets. And obviously, tech leaders, whether it's data analytics or product tech, we interact with many different stakeholders, whether it's our own teams that know what we talk about, to all the way to, could be talking to finance and they have no idea what data analytics or tech is. How do you, defer your message or change your message according to those people?
Yeah. Again, I think it's if you've built the relationships with people in the first place when you don't need something from them, then you can start to understand who they are, right? It's sort of like the best time to look for a job is when you have one. The best time to build relationships with people is when you don't need something from them, right? So I think as a product manager, right, the role part of the role of product management I would explain is to be a liaison, to be a translator. So really understanding like what motivates a salesperson, right? What motivates a marketing person in general, but then also specifically, what motivates this person? Are they motivated by, power and stature? Are they motivated by relationships and getting people to agree? Are they motivated by data? Right. And so thinking about what people are motivated by, how they make decisions really helps you target your message. For example, I always say that, using data, whether qualitative or quantitative, is the best way to get across a point, right? It's not just I think, it's here's what the data says. But some people react better to numbers and some people react better to like quotes or videos or right, so sort of finding out about people, and you can do that. One of the things we recommend in the book is a stakeholder interview, which is very much like a customer interview. So it's just a conversation where you're getting to know somebody and you're interested in all of these things. And you can sit down and have a conversation like, hey, I'm interested in how the sales department works. Like, how does your compensation work? Tell me about that. And people are very happy to talk about themselves, and you can get a lot of really good information just by asking.
People will love talking about themselves. I mean, I think that's why mentorship is so popular nowadays. I think you just touched on something that actually is advisable in any job, regardless if you're trying to have an ulterior motive of doing a stakeholder interview. I think just understanding the business in general is incredibly important. How much does that play a part in kind of as you develop your product to really truly be able to build those relationships and develop a good product as well?
So, in the book, in the chapter on trust, we talk about a few different concepts like being dependable, and one of the concepts is ownership. And you think about ownership as, I'm doing my tasks, I'm responsible. But ownership, especially in the product management world, is more about something holistic, right? What are the risks? Who else might want to know about this? Does this match what the business's goals are? How does the business run, and am I helping or hurting? And so ownership in this concept is more about thinking outside the box. And when you think about how it will affect the sales team, that builds trust with the sales team, right? If you think about all of these other things and really own the product from a holistic point of view.
I really loved your framework in that chapter, where essentially, level one is doing your job really well, and then, as you work your way down the path, at the end, it's to your point, anticipating the business objectives, but also tailoring it so that it further enhances one of the objectives, whether it's revenues or costs or something like that. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and kind of how that translates in a way from being very junior to maybe being a little bit more senior in your career as well?
Yeah. So, you talk about leadership, right, in this podcast, and stakeholder management is a key driver of your ability to be a good leader. So there's 5 levels of ownership that we outline in the book. And the first one is doing your job well. Like, that's number 1,
Yeah.
right? That's not like number 5. So there's a lot more that you have to do and anticipate and think about in order to really own something. It's not just about doing a good job.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of that, like, especially when we think about we're stuck in our career paths and it's like, well, I do my job really well. It's like, that's fantastic. That's minimum requirement. But what are you
Yeah.
bringing to the table above and beyond that? When I give you a task, you're going to do it well. That's fantastic. That's what I expect. What are you bringing above and beyond to kind of help this business while still owning that task as a minimum?
Yeah. I think part of that is also like a generosity, right? Which is, hey, I just noticed this thing that I think might help you. I want to tell you about it.
Mhm.
And that generally, fosters goodwill, but also they might reciprocate, right? They might think of you next time. They're like, oh, they told me about this project that was going on that was related to me that I didn't know about. That was great. Like, I just noticed this thing. I'm going to go talk to them. And so those kinds of things build relationships too, to kind of be thinking about how can I give back.
Mhm. Yeah, I often refer to it in my when I talk to my direct reports about stakeholder management. It's this element of call it the informal undercover network that you built within the organization, right? That if I have trust and a relationship with someone in a different department, they might warn me in advance when something isn't good or coming down or something, versus waiting for the formal announcement like everybody else. I think there's an element there. Uh, the old Cold War relations between the US and Russia, for example, where they had secret sharing networks for.
Um, Fiction was mostly meetings. And a lot of, and you might think like, oh, that's a waste of time, but that's where the work gets done. I feel like that's where you're like, oh, that's interesting, right? Like, I didn't know about that. I'm glad I talked to you today, or I just talked to so and so. Here's something you need to know about, and it's all that kind of social networking that I feel like brings out the interesting things.
Yeah. And as much as you put processes in place to say, hey, that we should communicate more effectively, or there's always going to be things that, oh, it happens organically through a conversation that you don't think about putting down on paper
Yeah.
or sending out
And,
a news.
and I think that that's one of the problems with a more remote workplace for more junior employees too, because they don't see that. If you're in an office, right, they see these two people chatting or having coffee or whatever, they're like, oh, they're doing that. I might want to do that too. But when everything is, on Zoom or whatever, some of those cues are missed for
Mhm.
more junior employees. So I think it's also important that um, managers help people understand what's going on behind the scenes too.
Absolutely. You just brought up something really good, actually. We're now working in a hybrid environment, most companies, or even some remote now as well. How do you build good stakeholder management or relationships in that world? You're not going to bump into them at the water cooler. You may not necessarily know. So how do you advise people to develop those relationships via remote work?
So I think one-on-ones are good, like I said before, but also finding opportunities, excuses to be in person with people every once in a while. Um, I, when I was at Wayfair, we were organizing a trip to be in the same place with a key operational stakeholder.
Yeah.
And it turns out he needed to change his plans last minute. So, like, all 15 of us changed our plans last minute because it was so important to be in the same place. We were all going to view a certain process in the warehouse together. And it was so critical that we get that FaceTime with that stakeholder that we're like, okay, well, whenever you're ready, we'll go then.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes those opportunities, right, even, I'm going to visit a client. Do you want to come with me? Or,
Mm.
hey, I'm going to happen to be in your city. Like,
Yeah.
let's get coffee. I think some of those are important, not every day, clearly, but once a quarter, every once in a while to say, like, hey, I have a client who's in the same city as a key stakeholder. I'm going to find an excuse to kind of visit the client, to visit the stakeholder, and kind of make a thing of it.
Obviously, we work together at Wayfair, and that's where we kind of know each other from. And for me, based out of Berlin, working largely with
Yeah.
Boston, it was you had to go every 2 months. It felt after a period there was a disconnect, and then there was oftentimes more accomplished in a 30-minute one-on-one face-to-face
Mm-hmm.
month of conversations
Yeah.
virtually. So definitely
Yeah.
important.
During the pandemic, when we were working remotely, when it was like safe enough to actually get back together, but people weren't actually co-located in the same city. I made a point to get my team together, once a quarter, every so often at customer visits, just to make sure that we were in a room together. And like a couple of days can really kind of kickstart those relationships.
I'm going to take you back to earlier in my career, and maybe even probably the next month of my career. But I've had many ideas where I've always felt that they were genius, and I bang my head against the wall, going, "Why is no one care about this? Why is no one going to implement this? Why can't we get this thing done?" Lots of pushback and lots of struggle. What would you recommend I'd done differently in those moments?
Um, so I think a couple of things. One, right, there's that whole idea of make them think it was their idea.
Right? Yeah.
That's not bad advice, right? Figure out a way where it helps the other person and say, like, hey, I remember that you had this problem. I have this idea that I think will help.
Hmm.
And then it's no longer about you trying to push your idea. It's like, here's how I can help you. And people are much more receptive to that. Um, if if it's not actually helping anybody, then maybe it's not the
Bad
best idea.
idea. I'm sure there's a bunch of those cases. They were bad ideas. Yeah.
Sometimes things are nice to have. But if you can find a way to kind of tailor that message to what you know about the stakeholder. So, for example, again, a Wayfair example, I was working on damage reduction, so reducing the number of damaged products that went to customers. And I had this idea in the warehouse about like a directed workflow for the people handling the packages. And I was trying to figure out how to connect the two. And what I came up with was if somebody picking a box off the shelf sees that it's damaged, they didn't have a way to note that the
Mhm.
best thing for them to do, according to their job, was to put it on the conveyor and send it to the customer, even though they knew it was damaged.
Mhm.
So by creating a directed workflow to allow them to note that it was damaged and leave it on the shelf and pick a different one, I connected my concept of directed work in the warehouse with damage reduction.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I mean, no one goes to the office to do a bad job or to actively send damaged
Right.
goods. That the process isn't essentially set up in a way that allows them to share that back or improve that process.
Exactly.
Yeah, when we see a lot of what you just talked about, like tying it to the business objective, is something that we often see in data and analytics, right? The concept of data quality is something that we always harp on, data quality, data quality, data quality. But when you talk to someone in marketing, okay, I would want better data, yeah, but I'm not willing to do that at the expense of improving my campaign success rate, for example. And so I think what you just mentioned there, if we're talking about it from a data perspective, is translate that quality into what does it mean for data. And I think you touched a bit on that in the book as well, where turn that into this will help you improve your conversion rate by 5%. Okay, well, now I'm interested. This will help you target better customers so you don't spend more ads on Facebook. This will help you in this way. At the end of the day, is it still a data quality solution? Yes, it is, absolutely. But to them, it's helping them meet their objectives.
Yeah. Specifically about this in the book, where instead of talking about data quality, the product manager that I know talked about customer confidence.
Okay.
And so you can talk to marketing about reducing churn because customers see the data, they don't believe it, they don't trust your product, they're not going to come back. If you improve the data quality, then the customer trusts the product more and you're not going to get as many people churning. So thinking about from their perspective, what are the metrics that somebody in, you know, marketing or sales or customer support or wherever care about, right? They don't want customer churn. So you say, well, here's how it connects.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the way that you wrote the book. I mean, I don't want to fan too much over it. Obviously, I'll let people, I hope people will find it, but I love the way you wrote the book. I got severe anxiety just dealing with sparks on a basis and
Yeah.
just this element of like, oh my God, what would I do if I was in the shoes of Irie? But, one of the things that she actively took in the narrative of the book is this concept of conflict mining, actively seeking out conflict to create, to just name it out. Why do you think that's so critical? Because I mean, you talk about it obviously in the book, and how do you advise somebody to build that muscle as well? Because that's something that I'm can be
Yeah.
terrified of.
Yeah. So I want to sort of pause to explain for podcast listeners what the structure of the book is. There's a through line narrative of a character named Irie who's starting a new job and she's navigating stakeholder relationships, and there's this stakeholder called Sparks who's kind of her nemesis. And I was actually worried about giving people PTSD from stakeholder
Ah,
relationships, but I'm glad it's resonating. And so one of the things we talk about in the book is let me go back. The other part of the book is explanatory in between the narrative portions to give more context to what she's doing. So in the book, we talk about mining for conflict. And in negotiation, right, you think about never take no for an answer. This is sort of like never take yes for an answer. You want to make sure that people actually agree because there's various ways in which people might say, yeah, 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 or like, I guess, or sure,
get me out of
right?
this meeting.
There's some obvious ways that you're like, do you mean that? But sometimes people seem to have an honest yes.
Hmm.
And in if they don't really mean it and you didn't notice, it'll come back later to bite you.
Hmm.
So the idea of mining for conflict, and we give a couple of like specific strategies in the book, is to say, okay, if you agree, can I give you an assignment related to it? Right? Can like what will you sign up to do based on this agreement?
Hmm.
And you sort of have people put their money where their mouth is a little bit, and they say like, "Oh, well, I didn't realize it was going to be work for my team. I'm not sure I agree with this."
Yeah.
And some of that you can do in a group, right? Like, what is your level of confidence that this will work? Like 0 to 5. Or you can do it individually, saying, like, hey, I noticed a little bit of hesitation in that meeting we had earlier. Is there anything you want to share.
Hmm. Yeah, and then hopefully you get true yeses instead of these artificial
Mhm.
be out of the meeting or yeah,
Yeah.
whatever you need until 2 months
And
later when you already did a bunch of work and no longer there's
they're like,
anymore.
oh, I didn't really mean that, or I didn't think that's what we were talking about. And a lot of times you find that's just a tweak. It's like, yeah, I mean, I basically agree, but there's this one thing that I think is going to be a problem. That's easy to fix if you know about it.
Very much so. Just kind of last question from my perspective. I think we often get to talk about stakeholder management typically when there's a conflict. I'm upset with this stakeholder, they're not supporting me. How do I manage them? That's one thing. I think, the book gives a ton of advice that you can do, obviously, to build a really great stakeholder management model. But what's one thing that you would recommend people can just do today that will start getting them on that journey? Because I think that's often the headache is starting this process.
Yeah. Um, well, first, I agree that some people only think about stakeholder management where there's like
Yes.
something to manage, right? Like a emergency or something. But if you start then it's definitely too late. So I think one thing that people can do today is think about who their key stakeholders are. And we talk in the book about a concept called power players, which aren't necessarily the people that you would pick out on the org chart, but you know, the person who has coffee every morning with the CEO, even if they have a weird title like partnerships. um, and finding who those people are, making a list of the key stakeholders that you really, really need on your side. And then trying to find opportunities to do kind of a stakeholder interview or have a one-on-one or get to know them a little better. Say like, hey, I know we've worked together for like 5 years, but I'm really curious about this and I was hoping you would help me understand. Um, and those kinds of you don't have to be new at the job. Being new at the job gives you a great excuse, like, hey, I'm new here, I want to learn. But even if you've been there for a while, saying like, hey, we never really get to talk. I'm curious, like, what are you working on these days?
Yeah.
Even general open questions like that, I think, are helpful.
Yeah, and you really touch on that in the book, the concept of power players and really understanding who is going to be the one that, without even thinking about it, could completely derail your project. They could completely not even be on the project team. They could still derail it in some way. So the fact is you
Yeah.
got to think about that and engage them and build those relationships.
I actually worked at a company where I had a stakeholder whose title was user evangelist. And he was just like in a bunch of meetings and nobody really knew what he did. But there was definitely a feeling like, okay, I know this guy's important for some reason. I'm not totally sure why, but it's somebody I definitely need on my side.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you had evangelist in his title. I mean, it was obvious. You need the evangelist always on your side, no matter what they do.
It sort of
Uh,
felt like he was in all our meetings to make sure we didn't mess it up.
There's a lot of that. There's a lot of that still. I mean, thank you so much for joining. Obviously, this book, fantastic. I know it's written for product leaders, but this applies to data leaders, analytics leaders, tech leaders, anything really. And the more that we focus on, the more that you think about stakeholder management in your career, the more likely you are to make inroads upwards because you're building allies, you're building great products, you're getting outputs that are going to or outcomes that are going to be beneficial to the company. That's how you get recognition. So this book has all the tips in here. So thank you very much. But before we wrap up, how can people find you? How can people find this book?
Yeah. So you can find Book Aligned on Amazon. And you can also go to alignedthebook.com for more information and for downloadable bonus content.
Even better, downloadable bonus content. That's the way to do it. Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us. Great, insightful conversation, and I hope that people learned a lot from our chat today.